You probably picture it the same way most people do. A massive room, thousands of people singing at once, a pastor on a stage the size of a small arena, and somewhere behind the scenes, a bucket getting passed around. Big building, big crowd, big collection plate. That's the whole business model, right? A bigger version of the church down the street. It isn't. And the gap between that image and what's actually happening is where this gets interesting. Because here's the detail that breaks the simple picture. The room isn't the business anymore. For the largest of these institutions, the physical building is often the smallest part of the revenue. The real machine is somewhere else entirely. And once you see where, you start to understand why some of these organizations end up worth hundreds of millions of dollars while facing almost none of the financial oversight that governs literally every other business of comparable size. Start with the basic definition, because it matters. Researchers at the Hartford Institute for Religion Research classify a church as a megachurch once it sustains a weekly attendance of 2,000 people or more. By that measure, there are roughly 1,650 to 1,800 of these institutions operating in the United States today. That's not a handful of outliers. It's an entire parallel industry hiding in plain sight inside a category most people don't think of as an industry at all. And here's the first number that should surprise you. The estimated median annual budget across these churches sits somewhere between $4.7 million and $5.5 million, depending on which year and data set you look at, not the biggest ones, the median. Half of all megachurches in the country are pulling in more than that every single year from an audience that pays nothing to walk through the door. So where does $5 million a year come from when nobody's charging admission? The obvious answer is tithing. The practice of members giving a portion of their income to the church, often around 10%, as a core expression of their faith. That's real. And for most megachurches, it's still the largest single line item. But tithing alone doesn't explain the outlier. It doesn't explain how a pastor ends up with a private jet. For that, you need to understand what tithing actually becomes once an organization gets big enough. Not a donation, but a reliable, recurring, and almost entirely voluntary revenue flow. The closest thing to a subscription model that exists in the nonprofit world, except with no service level guarantee and no refund policy. That floor is what allows everything else to get built on top of it. Once a congregation crosses a certain size, growth stops being about the room and starts being about reach. And this is where the real financial engine reveals itself, because the biggest megachurches don't primarily make their money from the people in the seat. They make it from the people who were never in the building at all. Take Elevation Church, based in North Carolina. Its in-person weekly attendance across all its campuses is a little over 17,000. Respectable, but nowhere near the largest in the country. And yet in 2024, the church reported taking in more than $91 million in tithes and offerings. How? Because its actual audience isn't the room. Online services reach an estimated 450,000 live viewers most Sundays, on top of hundreds of thousands more watching recorded sermons on YouTube every week. Its music division, Elevation Worship, streams over 2.3 billion times a year across every platform combined, a number that puts it in the same conversation as major commercial record labels, not local congregations. Read that number again. 2.3 billion streamed from a music arm attached to a church. That's the counterintuitive part everyone misses. The visible metric, how full the building looks, tells you almost nothing about the size of the business behind it. A church can look modest in person and still be one of the largest independent media operations in the country because the product being distributed was never really attendant. It was content. Worship music, sermon clip, conference footage, book deals, streaming, rights. Assets that scale the same way any other media catalog scales, except this one is protected by legal exemptions no ordinary media company gets anywhere near. And that protection is the second half of the mechanism, and it's the part that changes everything about how you should think about this entire category. Under US tax law, churches are automatically classified as tax exempt. That part isn't unusual. Plenty of nonprofits are tax exempt. What's unusual is what comes next. Unlike virtually every other nonprofit in the country, churches are not required to file the standard public financial disclosure, the Form 990, that the IRS requires from other exempt organizations, a university, foundation, a hospital charity, a local food bank. All of them have to open their books to the public every year. A megachurch generating tens of millions of dollars does not have to show anyone a single line of its budget, unless it chooses to. Some do choose to voluntarily. According to Hartford Institute research, about 78% of megachurches submit to some form of external financial audit. That's a meaningful number, and it means most of these institutions are, in practice, more transparent than the law requires them to be. But it also means that roughly 1 in 5 of the largest, wealthiest religious institutions in the country is operating with essentially zero mandatory financial visibility. The exemption isn't a loophole a few churches found. It's the default setting for the entire category. Now put those two pieces together. A revenue engine that can scale into the hundreds of millions through tithing, media rights, book deals, and conference income, and a legal structure that doesn't require anyone to prove where that money actually goes. That combination is the entire story. Everything else, the private jet, the mansions, the scandals you've probably heard about, is just what happens when that combination meets a person willing to use it. This is the point where the chain reaction usually starts. A congregation grows. Growth requires a bigger venue, more staff, more production value. And megachurches take this seriously. Some of the largest have. Literally purchased former sports arenas to house their services. Joel Osteen's Lakewood Church in Houston operates out of the former Compaq Center, the one-time home arena of the Houston Rocket, retrofitted to seat around 45,000 people a a week. In 2017 alone, Lakewood reported receiving more than $89 million in support and other revenue. That's not a typo for a religious nonprofit. That's a figure that would place it inside. The revenue range of a mid-sized publicly traded company generated almost entirely from voluntary contributions and media reach. As the audience grows past the physical room, the media arm becomes necessary, not as an afterthought, but as the growth engine itself. And as the media arm becomes the dominant source of revenue, subtle shift. The organization increasingly resembles a production company or a publishing house far more than a congregation. It has content licensing. It has merchandise. It has conference ticketing. It has a brand to protect and monetize. But it retains the tax status, the legal shielding, and the total absence of mandatory disclosure that were designed for a small neighborhood church with a folding table and a hymn book. That mismatch is where the risk lives. Because when an organization has real revenue at the scale of a media company, but the oversight requirements of a 200-person congregation, personal enrichment, doesn't require anyone to break the law. It just requires nobody asking to see the book. Which brings us to the case that shows exactly how far that gap can stretch. Kenneth Copeland began as a traveling evangelist in Texas in the 1960s, building an audience gradually through television broadcasts, centered on the prosperity gospel, the belief that faith and financial generosity toward the ministry are directly rewarded with material blessing. Over the following decades, Kenneth Copeland Ministries grew into a sprawling operation, dozens of affiliated churches in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, a television network, and eventually a 500-acre private campus in Texas complete with its own airstrip and hangar, built specifically to house a fleet of aircraft owned by the ministry. By the mid-2000s, that fleet included multiple private jets, at one point valued in the tens of millions of dollars. Combined, along with an 18,000 square foot home the Copelands claimed as a tax-exempt religious parsonage. Flight records later obtained by journalists showed the aircraft making repeated trips to vacation destinations: Hawaii, a hunting ranch, a ski resort in Colorado, alongside their stated ministry travel. In November 2007, U.S. Senator Chuck Grassley, then the ranking member of the Senate Finance Committee, launched a formal investigation into Copeland's ministry along with 5 other prominent televangelist organizations, citing public complaints about tax-exempt resources funding personal luxury. Grassley's request was simple on paper: show the committee the financial records. Copeland's response was to refuse, arguing the request amounted to government overreach into religious affairs. 2 of the 6 ministries under investigation cooperated. Copeland's did not. The investigation dragged on for roughly 3 years. When Grassley's office finally released its findings, the report described an extravagant lifestyle, the multi-million-dollar estate, the aircraft, a pattern of loosely governed spending, but reached no legal conclusion because Copeland's ministry had successfully avoided producing the financial detail that would have made a conclusion possible. No charges were filed. No exemption was revoked. The jets kept flying. In fact, in 2018, Copeland purchased a 3rd private jet, a Gulfstream V, reportedly buying it from a Hollywood actor. Notice what actually happened in that chain. It isn't a story about someone getting caught and facing consequences. It's a story about an organization discovering that the same legal structure that let it grow also let it stonewall a sitting U.S. senator for 3 years with no penalty at the end. That's the counterintuitive gut punch of this entire industry. The opacity isn't a side effect of the system. For an organization willing to use it that way, the opacity is the system working exactly as designed. To be fair to the broader category, Copeland is the extreme edge, not the average. Most megachurches are not sitting on private jet fleets, and the 78% audit participation figure suggests a real, if imperfect, culture of voluntary accountability across the space. There's a version of this model that functions closer to how it described on paper: a large congregation reinvesting tithes into genuine community programs, disaster relief, addiction recovery ministries, and local outreach. Activities plenty of megachurches genuinely fund at meaningful scale. That's the optimistic outcome, and it's common enough to be the norm rather than the exception. But the realistic negative outcome isn't rare enough to dismiss either. Between 2007 and today, multiple prominent ministry leaders, not just Copeland, but others swept into that same Senate investigation, have faced public accusations of blending ministry funds with personal wealth, almost always without triggering a legal consequence proportional to the scale of the money involved. The structure doesn't punish that behavior. It simply doesn't require anyone to notice it in the first place. So what is a megachurch? Once you strip away the stage lighting and the worship band, it's a legally unique hybrid. Part media company, monetizing content and reach at a scale that rivals commercial publishers and record labels. Part real estate operation, often owning and expanding physical campuses worth tens or hundreds of millions of dollars. And part financial black box, protected by an exemption built for a category of institution that, at this scale, it barely resembles anymore. The tithing you see on a Sunday isn't really the product. It's the entry fee into a much larger, much less visible economic engine. One where the biggest number was never the size of the crowd in the room, but the size of the audience you never see, and the amount of financial detail that audience is legally entitled to never find out.